I think like a memoir, you feel stuck by the facts, and I think like it felt much more. I don't know. It was like the narrative engine to not be truthful and to sort of like make things go crazy. Felt like I could be more honest and less afraid of like saying something wrong or saying something like fucked up or like betraying something. It just like felt like, and I don't know. It just like felt like I could play with things. Like right, it's not actual autofiction. Like obviously, I was not like possessed by a demon or anything, or like I have sleep.
Or so you say.
So I say, right.
Hello and welcome to Urgent Futures, the show that finds signal in the noise. I'm your host, Jesse Damiani. I'm a writer, curator, and professor who's on a continual quest to learn about reality and how it's evolving. Each week, I sit down with leading thinkers whose research, concepts, and questions clarify the chaos, from culture to the cosmos. My guest this week is Grace Byron. Grace Byron is a writer from the Midwest based in Queens whose writing has appeared in The New Yorker, Vogue, The Nation, New York Magazine, The Paris Review, and elsewhere. Herculine is her debut novel. Imagine this, an all-trans girl commune in the middle of the woods in the Midwest. Also imagine that people can be literally haunted by demons who prey on trauma. Imagine that these two ideas live in the same world and are woven into a broader story that also manages to hold within it star-crossed romance, biting analysis of the contemporary creative scene in New York City, revealing moments of friendship, community, sex, and ultimately a portrait of what it means to be a trans woman in present-day America. All in about 250 pages. Hopefully your mind is already spinning with possibility, and I'm delighted to inform you that all this and more is what you'll find in Grace's superb debut novel, Herculine. It should go without saying, but I'm going to say it. Go buy this book. There's a link in the show notes, but it's available wherever you get books. As a lover of language and narrative, I was excited to dive into all of the above with Grace, and she has lots of great things to say. But of course, our conversation extends beyond the craft of writing. We get into a broader examination of the aforementioned topics, further drawing from her work as a critic, especially given the systems of oppression that trans people face, spanning scales local to societal. The best speculative fiction is that which uses the mechanisms of imagination and storytelling to reflect and refract what's happening in contemporary society, to help us see messy truths in more nuanced, complex ways. Herculine manages this tremendously. A testament to Grace's insight and ability to synthesize and translate ideas across forms. These abilities are on full display in our chat. Never fear, this whole conversation is spoiler-free. But as a bonus for paid subscribers, I've recorded a whole separate part of the conversation that gets into the nitty-gritty, unpacking the book in a way that I believe will be immensely enriching for folks who have already read the book. Note, tons of spoilers in that conversation. If you want to hear it, be sure to subscribe at realitystudies.co. So, that out of the way, please enjoy this powerful conversation with Grace Byron. I am lucky to be joined by Grace Byron today. Grace, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am as well. The Inciting Incident is this incredible book. Is it Herculine or Herculine? Is it
I
the
think
French
Herculean,
or English?
but
Herculean.
if you want to go French with it, you should.
I'll stay English, but for French folks, I just want you to know I know that it's pronounced Herculine. First of all, I think the best place to start is how would you describe the book in your words?
Yeah, I think that the sort of elevator pitch that I've been giving people is it's sort of like trans Buffy. Like it's sort of like about a girl who is like living the sort of like 20 something young person life, but is also sort of like dealing with like a supernatural element. And it kind of like moves through sort of like a more realistic component that's like set in New York. And then the main character ends up like at a commune, and things sort of start going awry. And it's this like all trans girl commune where she's like trying to get back with her ex, and it's just complicated and messy. And she's sort of like working through trauma. Yeah, I think that's how I would describe it.
Great. And there's a lot to not say to avoid spoilers.
Depends.
Um,
Yeah. However
yeah.
much you want
Well,
to get into it.
I want to get into all of it. So my proposal to you is this: we could have the whole first part of talking about the book be spoiler free,
Sure.
and then maybe we have like a dedicated section that only lives like behind a paywall, so
Sure.
people sort of know going in,
Yeah.
like we're only going to get okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so yeah, I think within the realm of no spoilers, we know that this book is haunted.
Yeah.
That's in the sort of the promotional materials for the book. So one theme that resonates really strongly is this relationship between trauma and haunting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to invite you to speak kind of to that parallel and what you're playing with there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in like very steeped in Christianity in the Midwest, and sort of like that was sort of like the lore and the religion and the mythology that I grew up in. And so I think in the same way that like some people would try to play with like Greek mythology or Buddhist mythology or whatever, like the thing that I knew and was versed in was Christianity. And so it like felt interesting to sort of like parallel the trauma of conversion therapy that the narrator is going through with sort of like Christian ethics and Christian like ideas and like obviously like some of the demons are not pulled from like Christian mythology, but a lot of them are. Like Asmodeus is in like one of the Catholic books of the Bible, and like the book sort of like starts out with sort of just like the main character like thinking about these parallels between like being like haunted by having like grown up in the Christian church and like surviving conversion therapy and also like having sleep paralysis demons. So there's kind of like this element of like living in fear and like trying to figure out like what all of that means for her and like how much of this is just sort of like in her head and how much of this is real. And sort of like as things go on, I think those parallels get clearer. But I think I also just like wanted to sort of like very viscerally dig into the idea of like what if the things you were most afraid of came true. I think like that's always just sort of like a really fruitful way to write. And sort of like whatever like the most bizarre body horror haunted stuff can happen. I think I was just like, let's throw that in there. Because that, yeah, I think like that felt like a. I think so many people who are traumatized like find a lot of interest in sort of like going into those like dark places and find that to be redemptive. And I think so many people love horror for that reason. And so I think it just felt sort of natural. Like it didn't like start out with like so much demonic lore. Like I think at first it was a very different kind of a book, but it just sort of like that overarching mythology felt like it was really interesting to scaffold the book.
Mm. What did it, if you don't mind me asking, what did it
Yeah.
start out as?
Well, I was trying to write a memoir for a long time. And that just like didn't feel right. It just like felt like too forced and stuck and just like I also just think there's so many memoirs and trans memoirs and trauma memoirs and so many of them are just sort of like cash grabs to me and feel really like boring and reductive and just sort of like not like they're pushing the envelope at all. And I felt like I sort of like wanted to do something different and it just like felt more interesting to sort of like start with this like girl who's living in New York and feeling competitive and feeling stressed out by like the collapse of the economy essentially. And she's just sort of like ruminating in this bitter way and like that part I think feels potentially like autofiction-y or like realistic fiction or internet novel or whatever. But then it felt more interesting instead of just like completely given to that impulse to sort of like switch things up and sort of like play with genre and play with like okay, so it starts with sleep paralysis demons, but what if like that part of the book starts to sort of like edge out some of the more like realistic components and sort of like force this main character to sort of like confront all of these things that she's been suppressing because the first part of the book is so like her trying to sort of be like whatever and sort of like being really cynical and like going into all these like thought loops about like internet culture and memes and like her friends who are trans in New York and like going to the club and then I think like very quickly like when she's sort of like in nature in this commune in Indiana she sort of like is almost like forced to like think through like what she wants out of life much more.
Mm. You brought up in that one answer like five questions I
Yeah.
want to get to. But I think the first is it feels maybe a little bit like a detour, but it's prompted based on something you said. You wrote this amazing piece in the Baffler a while back
Mm,
that was looking at the ways that this broad question of trans literature
mm, mhm.
manifests itself. And you were looking at the ways that the present tense is wielded as a device, and how that, in your estimation, delineates maybe these two large buckets of transness. Could you frame the argument you made in that piece and talk about how you were bringing those ideas into how you were trying to present the characters as real whole people
Mm.
in Herculine?
Yeah. I yeah, and I think that piece was a little controversial at the time. I think that especially just because like I had negative reviews of some books and positive reviews of others, and I think there's a lot of like ways that like you're supposed to only praise like literature by any minority, which I just like don't find interesting. Um, but I think like there's a way that the present tense can be. I think I say something along the lines of like it can be like a sort of like tunnel vision instead of like an opening up. And I think there's like a lot of trans books that are written in the present tense that feel like they sort of freeze time, even though they're like sort of like trying to expand and like get away from the idea of like the sort of like transition timeline or the idea of like a linear idea of like transition in time. And I think sometimes those books end up replicating those same ideas, even as they're sort of like trying to do that, just because I think the present tense can be so limiting. It's just like one tool. And I think like a lot of present tense fiction ends up like, I don't know, just like isn't the only way you have to write a book. Like there's just like such a long lineage of past tense or just like any, whatever, like first person, second person, third person. Like so many books right now are first person, present tense. And obviously this book is written in first person, but I was which was another thing I never wanted to do. I think so often like when I write a book, you end up doing a lot of the things you don't want to do. I was like, I don't want to write a New York book. I don't want to write a first person book. I don't want to write about my own life. And I ended up having to sort of like confront all of those things, but I still wanted to sort of like put a spin on it so that it wasn't like so I don't know. I feel like we've read those books, and and there are other trans horror books for sure, but I do think like this book is sort of like dabbling with a lot of different traditions, and like starts in a fairly like in one camp, and then I think by the end is like doing like weird experimental stuff too, and so I think like that felt important to play with, and I think like a big thing that that essay is also sort of like thinking through is like trans is not a genre. Like I think like there's a way that like people want to argue like that is like one bucket of literature when in reality like that's just one descriptor of a book. And like I think it also feels important for like to and in that essay too I tried to connect like present tense to like other present tense books. Like right, it's not just trans literature that's often in the present tense. Like that's a wider trend. And I think like it works. I think like Ursula K. Le Guin has this thing like it works really well for like a thriller, but you don't have to only be writing like everything as if it's a thriller. And I think like a lot of people right now like think that like writing a sort of like thriller first person-y autofictional thing like feels really contemporary and interesting and like buzzy. But I just think like I don't know, I think also writing the past tense lets you skip around in time a little bit more and have like a more fluid sense of time and you can have like past perfect and like like all of these things that I think just like allow for more room to think about like the fluidity of time.
I love that. Well, yeah, let's go deeper on. So you did choose first person, and you also have a nameless
Yeah.
narrator, nameless protagonist, and those are big choices to make. What was your what ultimately led you to deciding to make those choices? Because it sounds like you weren't maybe necessarily starting in that place.
Yeah. I think it started sort of as a short story. I think like after a while, like I gave up on trying to write a memoir and I was writing other short stories. But then I was writing this short story with this voice that essentially is now the first chapter. And it really just sort of like took over. Like it just was sort of this like really cynical. I feel like I was just sort of like letting things out in this way. And it's such like an exaggerated version of some of the things that I think, but like allowed me to really like get into that really bitter, intense, funny, cruel headspace that felt sort of like, oh, I'm writing into this like wound. Like I'm writing into this like really dark part of people's ideas about how painful it can be to like be alive or whatever. And I think like that felt interesting and like I was like, oh, something is clicking, like this voice is working. And it just sort of was like, okay, maybe this is actually the novel. Um and then, yeah, I think like that kind of a voice is just so it lends itself to the first person. I think like Greta Rainbow just wrote this essay about like Thomas Bernhard and just sort of like the sort of like bitter miserly first person novel and voice. And like I think that is definitely like a trend right now. It's just sort of like people are fed up and there's like a way that sort of like the grim first person like complainer is like really intoxicating to like our culture that is so interested in like a cult of personality and like narcissism and just like it's also a way to like think through those things even as you're sort of also perpetuating them. And so I think like there's like a way that that is also sort of like dialectically interesting to sort of like go to both ends of that. um yeah.
Mm. So I'm hearing a couple things, and feel free to
Yeah.
correct me, of course, but I want to go sort of deeper on them. On the one hand, it sounds like you're talking about fiction actually freeing you up to have maybe not to be more honest than you'd be in a
Yeah, no,
memoir,
I
but to
think
be
so. Yeah.
really okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like a memoir you feel stuck by the facts, and I think like it felt much more I don't know, it was like the narrative engine to not be truthful and to sort of like make things go crazy felt like I could be more honest and less afraid of like saying something wrong or saying something like fucked up or like betraying something. I just like felt like, and I don't know, it just like felt like I could play with things. Like, right, it's not actual autofiction. Like, obviously, I was not like possessed by a demon or anything, or like I have sleep.
Or so you say.
So I say, right. Like I have had like sleep paralysis demons or whatever, or like sleep paralysis, whatever you want to call it. But I don't really necessarily think demons are real. But so like obviously like that isn't true, but like I did go to conversion therapy, I did move to New York, like those things are true. And so it felt like a starting from a place of like somewhat grounded reality allowed it to be rooted in that and be truthful to the emotional experience while still sort of like getting into the and like grappling with this idea of like good and bad, like rural and urban, and like transseparatism versus not transseparatism, and just like sort of like all these sort of binaries in a way that felt like more interesting and like gave me more room to just sort of like fuck around and just sort of like see what like placing someone in those different extreme scenarios would allow for. That sort of like would go to the depths of experience in a way that like I, for instance, have not actually had. um yeah.
Mm. So yeah, so it's cool because with first person, you have this ability to, as you're saying, be more honest in certain ways because you're not wedded to the facts. You're also tapping into this zeitgeisty feeling, but you're creating too more intimacy in a way with the reader,
Yeah.
because if I were reading, let's take one to one the way conversion therapy is portrayed in this book. If I were reading that in memoir form, it might be really, really difficult for me to get through it in a way that it's still very difficult for me to get through it in the work of fiction. But I know that I'm in the hands of a storyteller,
Yeah.
so that I can relate to that differently. And again, it's not immunizing me from the pain that I feel, but I'm not getting so caught up in that individual person that I'm not able to then take in the larger themes and arguments that are being made.
Yeah, I think it felt important too to like not write. I mean, the narrator's always like talking about like sort of like the trans girl sob story, which is just like such a trope, I think, whether it's like a first person essay or a memoir or just like a sort of like longing realistic novel. Like I just think that has really been done. And I think like that's a big thing about like first person novels that I think can be a trap, and present tense ones too, is just sort of like giving the reader too much of what they want to sort of like consume as sort of like almost like an empathy vampire, or just sort of like feeding on trauma in a way that I think is really like not helpful for anyone and is not like challenging anyone and just like isn't, and just sort of like allows everybody to like maintain their ideas of like I'm separate from this. And I think like I wanted to sort of push people to draw them in with like some ideas and like a really like seductive voice, and then sort of like not front end the sort of like here's all the fucked up stuff or trauma that's happened, but sort of like give that piecemeal and sort of like I think the narrator is like a little antagonistic to the reader about like the desire to be like, okay, so like what actually happened? Like what happened in the conversion therapy? And there's like a lot of parts of the book where like the traumatic stuff is crossed out or is given in like fragments or is like told offhand or is like sort of like but at the beginning of the book the narrator will sort of like say something about like God or like heavenly landlords, and then we'll sort of like undercut it and like move on to something else, or it'd be like I was being harassed on the street and then I like bought a banana and a bag of coffee. Like I think like there's so much of that in the book where like she's trying to undercut this idea of like what a victim is or what a survivor is or like what being healed is and just sort of like trying to challenge that and like challenging those timelines around trauma too. Um and that I think felt important to not to sort of like give out the painful parts. And I think that in some ways like it makes it an easier read than like Boy Erased, like which isn't, another classic book about conversion therapy, which is like very spare and brutal in a different way. And I think like this book is also like it is about conversion therapy in a lot of ways, and like a lot of the book is about that and about ideas of like, is it wrong to be gay, like like or queer or trans or whatever, like in this way that kind of is like maybe edgy, just because like I think like there's a way that you could read this book and be like, oh, like that's trying to link sin and transness, and I think like that's like one reading that you could have when in reality I think there's another like more like less dialectical way or more dialectical way to read it that's like, okay, what if like this idea of like good or bad just like doesn't really matter, like just like isn't really applicable to this part of life. And so yeah, I think like that felt really important to just sort of like shift the conversation around trauma and conversion therapy and those things.
Mm. So you just said something again. It's like my brain is like swimming with ideas, but I want to like try to keep things connected when they come up in
Sure,
conversation.
yeah.
So it's one thing that's so deft about this book is the way that you're kind of making the mundane vivid,
Mm.
but then that's paralleled, of course, with like you're not putting a quote trans girl sad
Yeah, yeah,
story
yeah.
in this book. It's
Yeah.
there, but you're using other kind of like tools in the fiction arsenal to make it not the kind of like set piece that we're supposed to like feel a certain way about. So talk to me about the decisions you were making to try to offset those realities.
Yeah, like I think a big one is the voice and sort of like the sort of like spiraling, looping, meandering, like digressive, like narrator. Like the first chapter of the book introduces a lot of the ideas that you're gonna get. Like it introduces conversion therapy, it introduces a sleep paralysis demon, it introduces like this character's life falling apart and like not really connecting with anybody in a romantic way, having a vexed idea to community, having this like stressed out relationship with an ex-girlfriend. And then I think in another way there's like a lot of like literary allusions and references to like other kinds of texts, like and not just trans ones, but also like there's a lot of references to like King Arthur, there's a lot of references to like Joni Mitchell, there's references to like, you know artists like Greer Langton or David Wojnarowicz, and like sort of like building a world that feels lived in and connected and is not like siloed into like just one tiny place, and like it's like gesturing towards like, okay, there's a big world out there, and that felt like important to do too. I think like there's a lot of way like there's so many movies or books about trans people where trans people don't have any friends or like aren't in community, and I think this book was really like, this person has a lot of trans friends. It's not that doesn't make it perfect. It doesn't mean community is like a better thing. It just means like I think there's like that movie Monica that came out a few years ago. Like it's about a trans woman and she has no trans friends for some reason. And I was like, that I don't know anybody who's like that. Um, or there are, but it's just like I think a lot of people I know like do have a lot of friends and like have a rich interior world and like have a relationship to other kinds of culture and are not just like, I don't know, have a lot of interests, right? And that felt important too to like build that out. And then for the other characters, I think to also like have interests, and obviously like it is really focused on the main character, but like, she kind of has like a Sex and the City friend set at the beginning of the book where she has like Hazel and Nora and Ziamara, and like they all like have their own lives and like they do their own things. Um, and then, it's also like a road trip novel in some ways that kind of has that like classic thing. It has like two main locations, which so it's like a journey in that way. Um, and the second half is like kind of like pastoral. Like there's a lot of like gothic and Midwestern meanderings around the woods kind of scenes that feel like kind of important to sort of like get away from like trans people only exist in an urban context or trans people only exist in like one kind of place. Um, I don't know. Does that answer the question? I feel like those are some of the
Yeah.
different like strategies that were used. And then of course like genre, I think is like the other big one. Yeah.
Well, let's go there.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that was a big thing of what I wanted to talk about is getting your take on why. I mean, I feel like it's a little confining to call this horror because, as you've said, it's many other types of books. But obviously, horror is maybe the loudest generic element.
Yeah.
And so, why is horror a good place to explore the underlying ideas that you were exploring?
Yeah, my boyfriend always says like horror is a way to explore a very like human fear and like magnify it and sort of like twist the knife and like go in deeper. Like it has to sort of start with something really not mundane but like very like human, like a sort of like or like a fear that like people have about like the everyday world and then just sort of like blow it up in a way that like you're really digging into that and like it's all the more scary if it's like a really human thing, like if it's like so many genres of horror are about like trauma or like losing a loved one or the loved one coming back or like whatever the case may be. It's sort of like taking something and or like children, like things going wrong there, like all of those are tapping into like a really primal fear. And so it felt like to me like, and so much of horror is always about trauma, like so much of them start with like somebody passing away or dying. And I think like something like Hereditary, Midsommar, like I think like both of those were something that like I was like interested in and tapping into. And I was not like always a big horror person when my boyfriend and I started dating. Yeah, my boyfriend got me into horror. I wasn't like a huge horror person beforehand. And right before I started writing the book, we were watching like a lot of the classics. Like we were watching like The Exorcist or Candyman, like the original one, or I don't know, whatever. Just like there were, because it just was something I was very afraid of growing up. And I think in a way tapping into that was also sort of like a rebellious way of like writing about religion, was to sort of like do it as horror and to sort of like write about like, okay, well, what if demons were real? Like what if like being queer or trans was like connected to trauma? Like what if these things were true? And sort of like tapping into those like primal fears about religion and like what it means to like grow up queer in the Midwest, or like what it means to sort of like be haunted by your past, and like not be able to like escape those things. And I think like horror is just like a vessel for thinking through that in a way that I think a lot of trans people are connecting into right now. Like I think Ethel Kane is like such a big influence on that for a lot of people, and then like Christian Felker Martin and Alison Rumfitt, and it's just like a thing that I feel like we're seeing more and more of, just like as the world is so terrifying and just like it's almost hard to like keep ahead of that, right? Like just sort of like, okay, well, how do you like make something horrific when the world is already so horrific? And so I think for me it was sort of like, well, what if like other trans people were also capable of being really fucked up, which is just true. But I think like that felt like the sort of like one of the taboos to tap into, in addition to the sort of like spiritual warfare component. Yeah.
Yeah, you hit right on something that I wanted to talk about, and you sort of made comments that sort of point toward this. But obviously, we're at a moment historically where trans people are under attack, and you're writing this book where you're kind of leaning into the kind of classic feminist idea of like feminist narrative doesn't mean that all the women are great
Yeah.
people. It means that they're real and honest, and they're allowed to be that in the sort of full spectrum of moral complexity. And you're doing that with trans people, but trans women in particular.
Yeah.
And that's heavy. And if I were in your position, I'd feel a lot of both responsibility and fear doing that. So I wanted to kind of hear from you, like, how were you thinking and feeling into that, and what were the decisions you were making to try to do that honestly and carefully?
Yeah. I think like one writer and theorist that I really admire is Sophie Lewis, who just wrote this book called Enemy Feminisms. I don't know why that's so hard to say. And it's just sort of like about the ways that like feminism is not always like a liberatory tool, and like women across the years have like committed atrocities in the name of feminism, whether that's sort of like in terms of like being pro slavery but calling yourself like a feminist, or being like a Zionist, or being a TERF, or like all of these different ways that like no matter who you are in terms of your identity, you can like commit sins. Like you can do fucked up things. And I think like it felt almost like an important corrective to be like, no matter what your sort of political strategy is, you can still commit harm. And like that's important to recognize. And it doesn't mean that, for instance, trans separatism is an inherently wrong strategy, but I do think it can be a dangerous strategy if you go into it naively, thinking you won't get hurt or that you won't still have some of those same like vectors of oppression. Like all of the things that you like bring in from the outside world are gonna follow you, and like you're not gonna sort of like never be capable of doing harm just because you're trans or because you're whatever, whatever the sort of identity is. And I think like it felt important to sort of like lean into that and sort of like talk about that honestly. Like there's like when the main character's in New York, there's like a lot of like hyper competition between these trans women who are like trying to be like the hot freelance girls, or who are like trying to make it in New York, or like get a job or be an artist or whatever. And then later in when she was in the commune, right, there's just like a lot of like jealousy and like fighting over who's the most fuckable, and like fighting over like resources. Like right when things are scarce, it can be really like crabs in a barrel. And this is something like I think a lot of trans writers before me have already like laid the groundwork to write about. Like I think like again like Gretchen Felker Martin or Tori Peters like have sort of written about those like poorly behaved trans women. And I think it's just like it's always more interesting to write about that. Like right, if I was just like writing like and everything was great and trans people are perfect, like I just that's not really a novel, right? That's like there's no conflict there. And I do think there is a responsibility for sure, but like I also just think it's like narratively interesting to write about like what is the most like horrible thing someone who's a trans woman could do, and then to write about it. Like I've written some short stories where like one of them is about a trans woman who makes an app that like helps people transition, but she is herself kind of transphobic, right? Or like one that's about like a trans woman who gets way too obsessed with true crime and like starts kind of doing fucked up things. And those things are just like a much more like interesting place to start from to me. And like I think there are lessons to be gleaned there, and I think I'm really against like the idea of like you must write like a morally perfect character. Like I don't want to, I'm not reading for moral education. Like I don't think that you get the same thing out of reading a book as you do out of like a political theory text. And I think that's good. Like I don't think they should be doing the same thing, which isn't to say that they can't have like political implications, but I do think that it's important to like understand like I don't know, like a narrator is not like an emblem of your morality.
Totally. Well, and but this is where we live in a complicated time literarily, because with things like book talk,
Yeah.
there's a lot of like, I don't like this
Yeah.
character, I don't like this person, and therefore I don't like this book.
Yes.
So it's just a really messy moment to do something so nuanced.
I mean, oh well. Yeah. I mean that's true. And I yeah, and like I have read some Goodreads reviews that said they don't like the narrator of this book, and I just think that's so besides the point. And I think like is often really gendered and is usually like put up against women, and like well Philip Roth like all of his characters are so unlikable, but he's a genius. And so like why is that like something that's only like targeted against certain people? And like I don't know. I also think like yeah, people have a hard time separating like the narrator from the author from the book. Like right, and all of those are different things. And reading comprehension is just is rough right now. And but I don't, I'm not like a romantasy writer, and that's not what I'm trying to do. And like that, is like another genre, and like God bless, is just not what I'm writing. And I think like that's also like where like the sort of like literary fiction impulse comes in. Like I think I admire more people like Ursula K. Le Guin, um, and I'm not like writing like straight pulp, for instance. But I also think like straight pulp has its moment, and like I don't like I'm not like trying to like. I think there's a way too like we kind of like shit on genre writing as like different or lesser, and I think like that's not really fair either. So I think that's like a careful needle to thread of like I don't know, like the ways that sort of like readers approach books and sort of like try to come to it like with their own ideas about like what a book should be. And I think like an ideal reader comes to a book open-hearted, yeah, which is hard. So we'll see.
Yeah. I'm optimistic for you. I was thinking through yeah, some of what I expect there'll probably be some people
Oh, for
that
sure.
that approach it that way.
Yeah, and
And
have
we'll get to
yeah,
this in the part with spoilers. We'll talk particularly about the character Ash, who I
yeah,
think is maybe the locus of
yeah,
where a lot of this
yeah.
conversation is going to come. But that'll be for later. So speaking of coming to books open-hearted, it's like coming knowing that there's maybe some base ground truths, like, in this world there will be human beings and they'll be messy and whatever, but you're largely open to whatever system that the author is sort of laying out, and you're evaluating it based on if it's succeeding on the terms of that system.
Hmm.
In your book, you're playing with Christianity in a really, really complex way. Um, and getting back to your point around um, questions of sin and the ways that, of course, again, I think it's impossible to read this book not in the context of the moment in which it's being
Yeah.
published, the way in which trans people are being demonized by Christians and have, for decades, but thinking about that kind of like haunting, that force of haunting, and that application of the sort of like term of like demon, or possession, or sort of the witch trial type of
Yeah.
thing, then being applied to trans women, that's complex.
Yeah.
So let's just start in a wide open space, and we'll kind of like zoom in as we go. What were you thinking about when you were playing with that sort of like a hot coal?
Yeah. I think, yeah, I think this like goes back to like whatever is like the most messy or hot coal that you can play with, like is often the one that you get drawn to because it's just like that's so rich and wild, and like that's sort of like the wildfire that you end up having to sort of like dance in. And yeah, I mean, I grew up being told I was wrong and I was sinful and like I was going to hell and all of that in church context in the Midwest, like at large, like I saw the preachers and the signs and all of that was true, and like had friends who said horrible stuff too. Like it just like was in the air, and this was like I also like grew up right before gay marriage was legalized, and like I feel like after that there was like a brief window of like quote unquote goodwill towards queer and trans people. Um, but I grew up with that. Like the kind of moment we're in, I feel like I experienced in a very personal way growing up, and it felt like I had to grapple with that in this book in some way, and sort of like the ways that we are told we're evil, right? And like I think like I was like, what if I sort of like spat that back out, right? Like almost as a weapon, like back against like another kind of group, and sort of like it's been weaponized against me, but like what if I weaponized it back, like in a sort of narratological way? And I think like the sleep process demons are always saying kind of shit like evil girl and like bitch and like kind of all of these horrible things. And like I feel like that's a voice that I know personally and felt like interesting to sort of like give space to that voice like in a book. Um kind of as like essentially as an antagonist. But also I think something that like the narrator ends up having to sort of grapple with in a very personal way. Um yeah, I think like it just like for me it made the most sense to like dig into that and sort of be like, okay, well what if the thing you grew up hearing, which is that like you're bad. Like what if like you kept hearing that like in your adulthood, which like a lot of us now are right now, like but from the right. And I think like giving that voice almost like a supernatural component as the book goes on. I think that it felt very violent to put into the book in one on the one hand, but also like very necessary to sort of like externalize it, right? Like I think like there's a way that the book also sort of like grapples with like this voice might be an external voice even if it feels like an internal voice. um and so I don't know, yeah, I think it felt really like almost like devilishly gleeful to like play with that voice like I grew up hearing and just sort of like turn it into like its own like mythology, and like it felt really subversive in some ways to like write about. And I think like you could read this book and say this book is like arguing that there's like an intrinsic link between like transness and demons, but I think in reality it's more playing with that like concept and link and idea, and like the idea that like trans people are inherently traumatized and all of these things, and sort of like saying, well, maybe like there are external forces that are doing some of those things, and like having some of those ideas that are like bringing that to trans people, that then makes it hard to separate those internal voices.
Mm. Well, that brings up another, like the kind of inverse of that last point you said, which is like another thing that you inherently risk in writing a book like this is that you're in some way validating the Christian
Sure.
idea. And so like, how are you trying to queer that takeaway, or like interfere with that takeaway? Because of course, any reader of this book is not going to walk away thinking like, oh, Grace is a big fan of
Christianity.
Christian belief
Yeah.
systems.
Well, I think for one, like, it's not God who's saying these things in the book. It's not God who's like kind of fucking around with the trans people. It's not angels. The book doesn't really go there, like, doesn't really get into God too much. It's more about like demons. And I think like the demons are definitely kind of like a mostly negative, somewhat ambivalent uh like group of people who are sort of like manipulating trans people because perhaps they have like suffered a lot and so like maybe have less to lose. Um and so that's like one element is right, like I think playing with like whatever like the idea of demons are and like which side they're on. And then I think that the other element is that yeah, I think the other element is like playing with like dualism and like non-dualism and like I think like the way that the narrator ultimately ends up like stepping away from this idea of trauma or like feeling locked into her trauma or feeling like locked into like Christian beliefs is to like step away. Like there's like a sort of like chapter where she is like in the woods and is like pondering and thinking about like beliefs and ideas and like she sort of ultimately feels like the way out of like this either or binary Christian logic or like good or bad or like am I sinful, am I tied to demons, am I not tied to demons, is not to actually give in or like say a prayer or whatever, but is actually to just sort of like step out of it and like in a sort of like quasi Buddhist like logic is to like step away. And I remember a long time ago when I was in college, I was like reading a lot of Mary Oliver and like reading a lot of like listening to On Being and like listening to like a lot of like other kinds of like alternative spirituality that I think like really approached like ontology in like a less like without certainty, right? It's just sort of like giving up the idea of like certainty. And around that time I saw this short film by Jatavia Gary, who's like a great black filmmaker, and she made this short film called An Ecstatic Experience. And in it there's a clip of Asada Shakur saying, I decided. And just sort of like in terms of like talking about like when she escaped from prison. And that's obviously like such a different element and like a different tradition. But I do think there's a way that like the way to like move through nationalism and like infrastructure and like Christianity and fascism is like to step out of it, right? Is like to actually not like try to argue with it so much, but actually sort of like step out of it and like try to do something else. And I think that is a difficult thing to do and like doesn't mean that you don't have work on either side of that. Um, but I think in the same way that like arguing with a Nazi online is like maybe not the most productive use of your time. Like I think like arguing like whether or not trans people are inherently damned or sinful is like not the most productive use of your time.
Well, I'll be I'll be curious if one such person picks up this book. um,
Yeah.
yeah, TBD on that. Um, one thing that I like to look for when I'm reading fiction are the kind of like minute or the minutia that are framed as throwaway but feel like they're a lot more
Mm.
freighted. And one such moment that I found in your book, and again, feel free to tell me I got this wrong. I tend to think not because it involves the title and the eponymous commune in question, is referencing how Ash came to the name of
Hmm.
to call the commune Herculine
Hmm.
and referencing Herculine Barban.
Hmm.
And there's this throwaway line that's like, Foucault wrote a book because of course.
Yeah.
And there's this lineage around that book where, you know, it's of course an important historical book, but it also treats the person Herculine Barban as kind of a case or
Yeah.
like an object. It in a very literal sense, like objectifies this intersex person. So I guess I want to kind of open up of like, am I right in deducing that there's maybe a dynamic that you're also trying to play with in this book that is sort of surfaced in that little moment?
Yeah. No, I think absolutely. Well, and I think the sort of like thing that I'm getting at there perhaps is that Ash is also sort of treating, right, Herculean like a case study. Is sort of like claiming this person as this sort of like transcestor or like trans elder from the past, even though this person is clearly like in a completely different tradition, right? Like I think like there's also just like a sort of like ahistorical way that like sometimes people look for like the past and sort of like to read transness onto like past people when it's like I don't know if you need to do that in order to argue for trans rights. I don't think you have to like say trans has always been in the way it is now historically to argue that people should now have healthcare. Um, which isn't to say that like transness hasn't existed for a long time in some form or another, but I think like there's also this sort of like way that like we don't do ourselves like a any service to any favors to sort of like put that back in when it like wasn't there. And like I think like there's a way to play with the archive, but I don't think you have to sort of like insert facts that are not there or sort of like claim things that are not true. And I think that is like one instance where I mean it's also kind of like did Ash read like this book? Like right like I think like there's a way too that is sort of like playing with like the way that certain theorists are picked up and set down as more like markers of politics than actually like than actual politics, right? Like I do really like Sally Rooney, but so many Sally Rooney books like reference a political theorist for like one sentence and then move on, and like that's the politics of the book is referencing politicians more so than actually engaging in them. Um, and I think like that's another just sort of like throw in a way that's I think part of what that throwaway line is getting at.
Mm. Well, this is actually another question I'd wanted to ask you has to do with kind of your identity as a fiction writer, not in contradistinction, but sort of in tandem with your identity as a critic.
Yeah,
And so, like, how were you thinking about the kind of like when you're writing a piece of criticism, you're of course putting your arguments and evidence for those arguments, you're bringing those to the fore, and that usually involves much more exposition of whatever theoretical base you're drawing from. Fiction, you can do that, and some authors do it, but it doesn't usually lead to the most gripping narratives.
sure.
So yeah, so kind of building on this, like beyond just that Foucault moment, though, feel free to sort of loop that in as well. How are you thinking about bringing in some of the denser theoretical ideas? You referenced Ursula K. Le Guin, but yeah, other ideas that were in your head and how you were weaving them in.
Yeah, I think like the things that end up finding their way into like a into fiction from research or work as a critic are always so subtle and so like tangential, or it's like something like you read offhand in a book and you're like, oh, that has to go into this fictional story somehow. But it's never like the main thing. I feel like usually, I mean, I was doing a lot of reporting on cults, but that happened maybe later. So I don't know if that was as applicable in terms of like thinking about things. But I have always been interested in cults and like had done a lot of reading on cults. So like I'm sure that found its way in somehow. I don't know if in like a super one-to-one way. Um ooh,
I mean, you don't have to say
yeah.
this, but I'll say, I mean, Christianity has a cultish quality. Not every
Absolutely.
Christian is in a cult, of course,
Yeah.
but yeah.
No, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, I mean, I think like a book I always think about is Steering the Craft by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I think just like has a lot of really great things to think about when you're writing fiction. Um, I think that I mean, I'm sure I was thinking about Foucault on some level, just because that's he's always around, even if just like as an annoying sort of grandfatherly figure.
Haunting us, as it were.
Yeah, I've read a lot of Hannah Arendt in my life, so I feel like her work is all like and her distinction between like the social and the political and the public and the private, I think is always maybe interestingly somewhere in the background. Um, I'm always thinking about Lavinius's idea of like the face of the other and like whether the face of the other causes us to turn towards empathy or to like turn away. Um, I don't know. Those are some things that I feel like in the past few years have been swirling around in my mind and like I'm thinking about and unpacking and perhaps on some level made their way into the book. I mean, Sophie Lewis also too. I think like the idea of like enemy feminisms, and also like her sort of ideas about family abolition. I think have wormed their way into this book too. I'm always thinking about Jules Gill Peterson. I think she's a great trans historian and like has written a lot about like trans politics and alliances. Yeah, those are some that I can think of right now. Yeah,
Amazing. Thank you. I want, so this will sort of hopefully gracefully wind down the spoiler free part.
yeah,
I want to talk a bit about your work as a critic since we're
yeah,
already here, and then I want to get into this full of spoilers
yeah.
part.
Great.
Um, so your output as a critic is prodigious. Most recently, you've been publishing a series of pieces for the New Yorker, specifically looking at contemporary trans issues in America. And so I want to surface some of what's coming up there. If anything, just to point people toward those articles. Most recently, you were writing about the complexities of gun ownership as a trans, or not speaking about you specifically, but
Yeah, yeah,
as trans.
yeah.
Um, so talk to me about that. What are the complexities of?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with people who owned guns in Indiana, and I have friends who own guns, and again, I think I'm always interested in like what is the thing that's going to be controversial or kind of like a zigzag. Like I don't like to be too predictable. So the first few pieces I did, I think people more or less were probably like, this is in line with Grace's previous reporting, like writing about healthcare or passports or like the war on trans art. And I think for this one, I wanted to sort of write something a little bit more, I don't know, just like to get into different territory and just sort of like get into something that I didn't feel like I'd seen anywhere, which was like interviews with trans people who own guns, especially sort of in light of the past few months, weeks, I don't know, like time doesn't feel real anymore. Just sort of like the DOJ saying that they were going to try to limit trans gun ownership. And it felt interesting and fruitful to me to interview people who are actually going to be affected by that potentially. I don't own a gun, but everyone that I spoke to did. And I think just sort of trying to think through the like link between citizenship and bodily autonomy and gun ownership, and also like I think in all of the articles I've written for the New Yorker, I've also tried to like link bodily autonomy and trans rights to like a broader context, whether that's like abortion or immigration, or in this case, like I wrote a little bit about the Black Panthers, and how a lot of early gun control laws were influenced by trying to limit the Black Power movement. And so I think like minority gun ownership is kind of like a fascinating case study for that reason. And I had been to a gun range a few months ago too, and had shot a gun for the first time. I'd always been open to it, and I just never had. After Pulse, uh, my mom was like, "You should learn how to shoot a gun," um, which is I think is that actually is in the book as a kind of aside. But and then I never did, and I had wanted to. So then this was just like the first time that I did it, and it was such a mundane outing. But I think like the idea of trans people owning guns is like such a hot button. It feels very like issue, like buzzy, like whoa, that's crazy. Because for two reasons, one of which is I think like there's a liberal response to gun ownership, which is very like just like knee jerk reaction, like anti gun, like no one should own guns. And then I think there's the other, which is like any minority owning guns is like I don't know. People see it out in the wild and they're like, that's crazy. Like that's like such a provocative image for whatever reason. And yeah, and so I was just like, I'm gonna talk to people and just sort of see what they have to say.
Mm. It's a great piece. I recommend everybody read it. It put me back in mind. First of all, the video, and I also recommend people watch videos of the Black Panthers from 1967. It's the video footage is really compelling for all the reasons that you're getting into. But I remember listening to the first season of It Could Happen Here by
Mm,
Robert Evans in 2018 or 19. I don't remember exactly, but it's an ongoing podcast now. But at the time, it was a self-contained season, and he was arguing based on his past experience as a war correspondent covering other civil wars that, of course, it could happen here in the United States. And it was very bracing at the time, but it felt very plausible. And of course, a lot of what he talked about, the sort of symptoms are playing out. So he's very prescient. One thing he talks about toward the end of that first season is he's I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's pro gun and believes that actually one of the ways to turn down the temperature toward this civil war is bonding over guns,
mm-hmm.
kind of bridging that divide. So there's kind of two things that come to mind for me. It's like what you described, pulling from the Black Panthers example, where it's like uh, gun regulation doesn't happen until white hegemony feels somehow threatened by it.
Yeah.
And then there's this other kind of thornier area of like maybe there's local social solidarity that might start to form because there's probably a lot of like you take your kind of stereotypical gun owner, they maybe have never met a trans person,
Yeah.
particularly in a rural area. And so that type of visibility, of course, when that progresses into hypervisibility, that becomes its own problem, which is sort of what you're playing with in that piece. So anyway, I was thinking about that, and I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see, based on writing this piece, the question of gun ownership? Like, leave aside for a moment whether or not the government is able to stop trans people from owning
Sure.
guns.
Yeah.
Let's assume that trans people are still able to own guns and that matters proceed apace. Do you see any avenue for paradoxically solidarity emerging from that?
I think potentially, yeah. I mean, I think it really depends on how much people let their guard down and like have class solidarity over like racial or gender solidarity. And I think that remains to be seen. I think I would like to believe that there's like the possibility. Um, and I think some people I talked to said it was really encouraging when they said the NRA came out and said we support gun rights for everyone. And they found that to be like, okay, like potentially there could be like an alliance over gun ownership. And I think like some of the trans people I talked to were like, I have friends who I go shoot with who are nothing like me, and I feel like we have found common ground over that. Or like go to like a training camp or whatever. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. That's like a potential avenue for comradeship. But I think I also spoke to people who were like, I'm terrified of the gun range now, just like after everything. And so I don't know. I think it's going to depend on a lot of factors. I mean, when I went to the gun range, everyone was so chill to me, like in a way that I found really surprising. But I also am lucky in that it was in Jersey. I think I pass more than some people do, which is complicated. But like I think like people are not like looking at me, and I think they're not necessarily making the same calculations as if I looked a little bit different. Um, and also like I'm white, right? So like I don't like I think like all of those factors made it so like I was probably gonna face less hardship going to the gun range than somebody else. And so I think it just like matters. I don't know. I think there's a potential, and I would like to believe that like people could bond over guns in that way. And like I think sometimes people have and do, and like I think there's a way to like be like, oh, you also shoot guns, like you're not so different than me. But I don't know. Yeah, I think it remains to be seen how willing people will be to sort of like let their guard down over something like that.
Mm. This laterally relates. In doing sort of research for this interview, I saw that you do episode recaps for
Oh
Task,
yeah.
and I also saw that you you um, you hosted an interview. I'm blanking on the name of the person you hosted the interview with, but you were talking about kind of propaganda, Mayor of Easttown, Task.
Oh, I wonder what I was
Um,
talking about. Yeah.
I know it's like, yeah, who knows what we said in any given
Oh, maybe it
online
was
forum,
Sophie
but
Lewis.
yes,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Um, so there's a dotted line here between the sort of head-on coverage of the issue of trans gun rights and these fictive forms that maybe implicitly or explicitly are sort of foregrounding the ongoing kind of reliance on the law enforcement apparatus.
Yeah.
How do you think about that, like in covering these shows and by your own admission being drawn to them sometimes even against your sort of better interests? Like, how are you thinking about that?
About propaganda in general, or
Yeah.
I mean, I think consuming media is not practicing politics. And I think that's like one thing that I find to be really frustrating about the online sphere in general is this idea that like listening or not listening to Taylor Swift is a political thing, or like it's just like that's not the same thing as like going to a protest or doing mutual aid or working in a soup kitchen or canvassing for a candidate. And I think that I'm also interested in the way that like propaganda tries to adapt itself as there are like waves of like how popular cops are. Like I feel like in 2020, like a lot of cop shows had to really adapt like what they were doing. Um and like this crime writer Tana French like ended up writing a book about a police officer who quit slash was like laid off after like a potentially like racially charged incident, and like it's about him sort of like grappling. And I think like in a similar way like Mayor of Easttown is like kind of trying to humanize a cop who is a little fucked up but also understands that cops aren't perfect. And I think we're now kind of seeing a backflip where cops I think are a little bit more valorized again. um but I think like everything is guilty to this to some degree or another. Like Marvel is complete nationalist propaganda, like all of like you can't really escape when something is big budget. It's going to play into like mainstream political discourse in a way that is usually fraught, because to get something made like that, it can't be too controversial. Like, um, and like right now, like there's a lot of debate over one battle after another, and like whether or not it is revolutionary or not. And I think it's just like, again, like watching a movie is not the revolution or whatever. Like it's not liberation. It's not like doing. It's it's not going on a flotilla to Gaza. Like all of these things, like it's just like not the same. And I think like we do ourselves a disservice if like we just like, try to center our politics on consumption, which I don't think means we can't be critical. And I also think it's important to like have critical writing around these things. Because otherwise people who are pro cop will do it for you and like write the stuff around it. But yeah, I guess that's my maybe response. Yeah.
Mm. No, I so appreciate that. And it again ties back to some of the ways that our ability to nuance our media consumption is morphing on social media.
Yeah.
Like thinking about the ways that folks on Book Talk.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean to demonize all the like Book Talk is a great thing. It's so
Yeah.
good that people are excited about literature, but the way that there's this like ongoing presence in Book Talk
Yeah.
that they have to like the
Yes.
characters in order to like the book. And so like media gives us a chance to kind of swim in it and see how we feel and like see what our inherent biases are and all of that. On that note, and I'm not meaning to ask you to like speak for the critics community
Okay.
here.
Yeah. Let's do it.
This is more about your take,
Sure.
because of course criticism is waning. There's amazing criticism that continues to happen, but less money from mainstream publications are it, there's less funding at mainstream publications for criticism. So this is my kind of like I may be like drawing you into my crusade
Yeah.
because like I'm such a like criticism is one of the main ways that I come to decide to read or
Mm.
watch or listen to anything. And so it's like I can't imagine a world with like less and less and less criticism. So what do you see as the role of the critic, the role of criticism, particularly filtered through the work you're trying to do in
Mm.
that capacity?
Yeah. I mean, it is brutal. The amount of like less and less like staff critics that are happening, and like the amount of critics who get healthcare, and also like the amount of criticism that ends up being PR like for people, and just sort of like the eternal war on pitchfork by people to by stands to be like you have to be positive, which is just like not the point of criticism. I think the role of the critic is to like intervene. It's to sort of like make some sort of a argumentative intervention into the way that people are thinking about a book, a movie, or whatever. It's to shine a light on something that not as many people have read. It's to excavate something out of a text that people aren't thinking about. It's to draw connections to like the wider world, to other pieces of media. Um, I think in my case, I often find that my work, I've been told, has like a slight political bend. Like I think even when I think I'm not being a little bit political, it ends up being that way. Just because I think as an ex-Christian, I'm always like, okay, so how do you live an ethical life, right? That's just going to come up no matter what. And I think the thing that for a lot of people replaces that is like some sort of like leftism in some way or another. Um, and so I think I'm like curious, like how politics plays a role in art and vice versa. I hope the role of the critic is not just to write about the new Taylor Swift album, but I worry that that's like where we're going, which is not to say that
Mhm.
people shouldn't write about the Taylor Swift album, but it does feel at this point in time like, you know, a new Sally Rooney book comes out, everyone writes about it. A new Ocean Vuong book comes out, everybody writes about it. But like, what about like the 20 million other books that are coming out that don't get any coverage, because now to get coverage you have to have already had coverage. It's really hard right now to review like debut books by authors, which I find to be like kind of brutal. They're getting like far less reviews. And I think that is worrisome to me. I think people are really like, okay, I'm going to review the new whatever. And that's kind of like the new Thomas Pynchon, right? Like all of these things. And like I want to do those things too and have done those things. And I think sometimes to be taken seriously as a critic, you have to do that in order to then write about other things. Um, but I would like to think that the critic like brings to light new things to the table. Um, and also like I also would like to imagine that the critic is not only like positively writing about things, but is also like saying when things are messed up or poorly constructed or whatever. And I think like making like a well reasoned case by case basis for that. Um, and I do think criticism is waning, but I also think we also have more critics than ever somehow, like at the same time. And I think like that makes me hopeful. And there's just like so many critics right now that I admire and like feel like I'm in good company with. And also I do think like there are great platforms still for criticism, like Book Forum or The Nation or, The New Yorker is still doing some books criticism, and I think that's amazing. And like I think obviously I wish there was more, but I think like it is happening. And like, you know, I think like we have amazing critics right now working like on Anahit Narcissian or Tiana Reid or, Andrea Long Chu or Patricia Lockwood. And like, I love reading the London Review of Books. And like, I think like there are places. It just like is for sure harder and harder all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Of the critics you mentioned, Andrea Long Chu really stands out to me as somebody talking about like absolute
Yeah.
fearlessness and an unwillingness to pander to
Yeah.
anyone. I was excited to see her appear in your acknowledgments. One other person to shout out related to the pitchfork, because as a dyed in the wool millennial,
Yeah.
I of course continue to be a pitchfork stan. Alphonse Pierre does
Oh,
some of the
absolutely.
absolute best criticism.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how he manages to pull off in such short space
Yeah.
what he pulls off and give you like the not full context, of course it's impossible, but to really
Yeah.
ground you in what the kind of soil you're playing in order to evaluate this music. Anyway,
I
so
also really like at Pitchfork Ariel Gordon. Have you read? Yeah,
yes,
I think she's
totally,
phenomenal. And Marissa
totally.
LaRusso. I think yeah, there's just so many great people at Pitchfork and Kiernan, and yeah, they just really have a good team. And yeah.
Yeah. Let's hope GQ doesn't totally ruin it. You brought up your Christian upbringing in that last answer. I was raised Catholic,
Mm,
and even though I'm no longer a Catholic, I definitely it's inescapable the ways that upbringing is sort of it's in my cells. And some of the ways I see that play out are like when I'll have flash judgment about something, or when I'm like feeling an incredible amount of guilt or something. Like all the kind of like obvious examples. How do you see, like, if you don't mind talking about it, and you're welcome not to, how do you see your Christian upbringing still manifesting in who you are as a writer today?
oh, I mean, so many. I mean, like, I definitely have like some level of moral OCD after my upbringing in a real like diagnosed psychological way, and so I'm sure that also ends up in my writing. I really am afraid to reference a text I haven't read, um, in like a way like I just like won't. It like brings me like to tears if I try to write about something I haven't actually read or watched or listened to. Um, and also, I think like when I write about an author, I try to read everything that they've written if I can. So there's like a sort of like completionist element or like wanting to sort of fit everything in. Um, and I think, yeah, and I think also like feeling the need. I think like early on in my career too, I felt this more, but I felt the need to like condemn any moral qualms with a book that I had before I got to my main argument. And now I think I just assume I feel like I've worked that a little bit, and now I feel like I don't have to say this book has this one misogynist moment or whatever. Like I feel like I can just sort of move on from that. But I think like that impulse is around this like impulse that like I get why people have that impulse when they're reading and watching things. Like I think it is like in our culture this like moral puritanical impulse. But I think that just is not doing anybody any favors. It's not like interesting. Um, and so I think like you have to like push that aside to actually get to the next thing. Yeah, and I think also just like in a classical way, like Christian concepts and ideas find themselves into my work. I think like I have like there's probably like a sort of like religious, almost theological, sermony component to some of my writing sometimes. I love to like reference, biblical imagery, like whether that's like from the book of Amos or Psalms or whatever. Like I'm sure that's like in in my work. It's just sort of like in a literal way, like the poetry that I grew up reading, whether I wanted to or not. And so, yeah, I think those are maybe some of the big ones.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so as I said, after this, we're going to get into all the spoiler stuff. So, folks, if you want to talk, if you want to hear Grace talk spoilers, that'll be in a separate video. But I like to close episodes with 3 recurring
Yeah.
questions. You've inevitably touched on this, so feel free to bring any of that back in or take us a totally different direction. The first thing is, what do you wish people paid more attention to?
What do I wish people paid more attention to? I think maybe the theme of some of the things I've been talking about are the way that bodily autonomy can't be siloed to one identity or issue, and the way that sort of like liberation around bodies and quote unquote DEI is actually an issue of material rights across different bodies, whether that is abortion or immigration or gender or transness or race or ability, right? All of these issues are linked. And I think it's all about like having the ability to be a body and move around freely. And I think there's a way in the discourse and a way in the way that we talk about gaining rights that we pretend that they're all separate instead of like this kind of like umbrella idea of bodily autonomy, which I think is like a much like more fruitful way of like thinking and arguing for material rights. And I think like there are scholars who are trying to do that work, but I think like often that is not paid as much attention to as like flashy identity based writing. Um, but I think it's important to sort of like link those in a material coalition.
I love that. Yeah, it doesn't lend itself as well to rage bait, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, no.
Nuance is the enemy of rage bait.
Yeah.
Um, what is one resource you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
Ooh, not your phone. Which is I think kind of like the classic answer. I think people should be reading more books. I think people should be reading history books. I think that people should be reading books that like make long sweeping historical arguments. Um, One recent book that I read that I feel like I found really centering and interesting and helpful was Paper Girl by Beth Macy, which is I feel like kind of the opposite of Hillbilly Elegy or something because it's about this woman who grew up in like a very like right-wing environment and moved away and then like goes back to sort of see how things are different. And I think she really carefully debrides like all the noise and static to think about how rural areas have turned really like conspiracy theorist and right wing. And I think it's just like a really like nuanced book about like fighting with your family and like coming to grips with like differing ideas. And it's also a book about like, okay, like what does political polarization mean? And like, are we close to civil war? And like, she also like intersperses these interviews with a trans kid who's living in this area. Like, it's such a fascinating and thoughtful book that I think because it's not like it's it doesn't have a title like Hillbilly Elegy that it like isn't going to get as many readers. Um, and I think like another book that does a good job of this kind of like thinking through reality is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, which I feel like a lot of people have already read, but I just think is like a really thoughtful, great long form book about literally about reality on some level, and our like political topsy turvy moment.
Mm, great recommendations. I've written down Paper Girl. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
So many. Um, I think that for me, a big game changer in how I organized my life and thought about my life and thought about politics was like the beginning of COVID and just sort of like being on lockdown. Um, and the ways that that opened up possibility of political change and also in some ways foreclosed others. I definitely like became much more solitary after that in a lot of ways. But also I think just like spent a lot of time like reading Audre Lorde and Foucault and Nietzsche and just like I don't know, like doing the homework, I feel like on some level, in a way that I guess like hadn't had time for before then. Um, and I think it just like I don't know, it was like cool to see lots of mutual aid and like the uprisings for Black Lives, but I think also it was like a time when we saw like an expansion of like the government crackdown on protest and on things. And so I think like it changed a lot for a lot of people about what we thought was possible in both pessimistic and optimistic ways.
Totally. I've actually had a few other folks say that as well,
Yeah.
and it's caused me to reflect on like the ways in which because I think it's very common to just get caught back up in your life and not
Yeah.
reflect on something that feels like still not so far enough away that it's either nostalgic or like uh, I'm sort of misstating this, but like as people have brought this up, it's like, oh yeah, I actually like as a person am different now.
Yeah.
Like it's not just that the
Yeah.
world is different and I'm responding to the different circumstances of the world. Like my personal habits have
Yeah.
changed. So I so appreciate you surfacing that.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, Grace, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures. And this episode will be out by the time the book is out.
Oh,
Is there
amazing.
anything else you want to say about Herculine that folks should know?
I don't know. Be prepared for a wild ride and a lot of demons.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you. No, this is great. Thank you so much.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.